Hello and welcome to Wavescan, the international DX program from Adventist World Radio. Researched and written in Indianapolis by Adrian Peterson and produced in the studios of WRMI Shortwave in Okeechobee, Florida. I'm Jeff White. Today on Wavescan, French radio in the South Pacific, New Caledonia, Part 2. Underwater radio. We'll hear about radio in New Zealand, and our special QSL of the week is the world's shortest reception report. Wavescan presents Focus on the South Pacific, a year-long series of reports on radio broadcasting and listening in the South Pacific. Well, the introduction of wireless technology into New Caledonia, the French colony in the South Pacific, took place in the year 1920, when a new wireless station was installed at the Semaphore Station in Noumea, the island capital. The Semaphore Station was a white square tower located on a hilltop, a little over 300 feet high. The call sign for this new maritime wireless station was FQN, indicating a French territorial position. The equipment at the station changed from electrical spark operation to electronic valve or tube operation in 1924, and a new call sign was adopted, HZG. Then, 8 years later, the transmission equipment was upgraded and modernized at apparently a new location, and again a new call sign was allocated, this time FJP. Test broadcasts from this new facility were noted in the United States on exactly 6,000 kilohertz and also 7,100 kilohertz in 1936. 2 years earlier, in the month of July 1934, photographer and electrician Charles Graveau in Noumea, New Caledonia, began to implement procedures in order to obtain government approval to establish his own amateur radio station. He took to the air during the next year with the use of his homemade transmitter rated at just 20 watts input, that is 12 watts output, as listed in a historic document. At this time, the Charles Graveau station, licensed with the amateur call sign FK8AA, was simply an amateur operation in use to communicate with any other amateur radio station that could hear his low-power signal. However, as was the custom in those days, there were occasions when FK8AA radiated music from whatever gramophone records were available. However, the real objective of Charles Graveau was to establish a radio broadcasting station, and on April 28, 1937, he began a regular program service over his amateur station FK8AA. Each Wednesday and Saturday evening, his radio broadcasts went on the air, an hour in duration, beginning at 5:30 p.m. This new radio broadcasting service was inaugurated over his amateur radio station in the family home at 44 Rue de l'Alma in Noumea, New Caledonia. He identified the station on air as Radio Noumea, though the official call sign FK8AA was still in vogue. The new Radio Noumea, FK8AA, was first noted internationally in New Zealand in January of the following year, 1938. And from that time onwards, the station was sought by many international radio monitors in New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. Even at such a low power, the station was heard occasionally at a great distance. Even though QSL cards were available, obtaining one was just as difficult as even hearing the station. The hobby and commercial radio magazines in the same three countries, New Zealand, Australia, and the United States, frequently reported news about the station, and on occasions even showed successful loggings. Initially, FK8AA was logged on 6120 or 6122 kilohertz, though in the earlier part of the year 1940, the frequency was adjusted to 6130 kilohertz. Perhaps the transmitter was modified at this stage to increase the power a little. Around a year later, the station, in its sign-off routine, added two more anthems to its scheduling. In addition to the French La Marseillaise, listeners now heard also God Save the King and the Star-Spangled Banner as a tribute to the island's allies. Soon afterwards, Marche Lorraine became a signature tune, for these still twice-weekly program broadcasts. However, due to the international attention that was coming to New Caledonia with the massive American presence, the local government began active planning in 1942 for an official government radio broadcasting station. This new station was inaugurated on air towards the end of that year, or perhaps very early in the next year, 1943. At that stage, the original FK8AA as a broadcast station was retired, though the amateur operation was revived again after the end of the Pacific War. The Australian magazine Radio and Hobbies reported the new station for the first time in April 1943, when a new channel, 6155 kHz, was noted, though the previous call sign, FK8AA, was still shown, perhaps incorrectly. The final listing with the FK8AA call sign in this same magazine was in July 1946. Programming and scheduling of the new Radio Pacifique Nouméa was very similar to the earlier FK8AA, and apparently the concept and perhaps some of the family staff were transferred from the old station to the new. During the latter part of the war years, the new Radio Nouméa increased its hours of on-air programming, and they also broadcast special programming for troops serving in the Pacific arena. That is the story of the amateur-become-professional radio broadcasting station, FK8AA, in Nouméa, New Caledonia. Interestingly, though, there was another radio broadcasting station on another French island in the South Pacific with a similar amateur background and with a similar call sign. This other station was on the air under the call sign not FK8AA, but rather FO8AA, and it was not located in New Caledonia, but rather in Tahiti. That's the story for another occasion here in Wavescan.
You're listening to Wavescan from Adventist World Radio. Send your comments and reception reports to Wavescan, Box 29235, Indianapolis, Indiana, 46229 in the United States. That's Wavescan, Box 29235, Indianapolis, Indiana, 46229 in the USA. Or you can email us at wavescan@awr.org. Our email once again, wavescan@awr.org.
It is known that at least 5 radio broadcasting stations, or major components thereof, are lying at the bottom of the ocean in the ship that was carrying the equipment at the time. 4 of these sunken ships were due to enemy action, and 1 was the result of a fierce winter storm. Back in the year 1940, soon after the onset of the European conflict, a 100-kilowatt shortwave transmitter manufactured at the Marconi Company in Chelmsford, England, was shipped out to Singapore Island. It was intended that this transmitter would be installed at a new shortwave station still under construction, adjacent to the early Radio Malaya station at Jurong on the western side of Singapore Island. When activated, the station was to act as a relay for the BBC London, with coverage into Asia and the Pacific. However, due to an attack by an enemy submarine, the ship was sunk en route, and the entire cargo was lost, including the electronic equipment for the new BBC shortwave relay station. Instead, a 50-kilowatt RCA shortwave transmitter was subsequently consigned to Singapore, but before it could be activated, it was removed and taken to Barbados in the Caribbean, where it was installed for cable and wireless at Bearded Hall under the call sign VPO. Back in the year 1941, plans were laid for the installation of a mega-powered medium-wave station at a secret underground location near Crowborough in England. This station was intended to beam surreptitious programming in various languages to continental Europe, and also to act as a BBC relay station for coverage into the same continental areas. At the time, a super-powered 500-kilowatt transmitter was nearing completion at the RCA factory in Camden, New Jersey, which had been ordered by NBC for medium-wave WJZ at Bound Brook, New Jersey. However, the FCC had imposed a 50-kilowatt power limit for medium-wave stations in the United States, and NBC WJZ no longer needed this huge transmitter. China demonstrated an interest in procuring this megalithic transmitter, but while negotiations were still underway, the British government arranged to purchase it and have it shipped across the Atlantic. The transmitter was re-engineered for 600 kilowatts, disassembled into smaller units, crated, and stowed separately into several different ships. One of these cargo ships, carrying the antennas and towers, was sunk in the Atlantic by an enemy submarine, and the equipment was lost. Very hurriedly, new towers and antennas were manufactured in the United States and freighted across the Atlantic, where it was all installed above ground for the underground American transmitter known as Aspidistra at Crowborough. During the latter half of the European conflict, PWI Press Wireless International manufactured and shipped across the Atlantic numerous transmitters, large and small, for use in Icelandic and continental Europe. Some of these shipments contained their famous 40-kilowatt shortwave transmitter, and other shipments contained complete mobile radio broadcasting stations. The mobile stations usually contained a 400-watt transmitter, always capable of high-speed Morse code, and sometimes also capable of voice transmissions. Much of this radio equipment was manufactured at their new factory quite near to their large shortwave station at Hicksville on Long Island, New York, and then shipped across the Atlantic. PWI states that at least one of these mobile stations was sunk by an enemy submarine in 1944, and that station still lies to this day on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. Also in the year 1944, Lord Louis Mountbatten expedited the construction of a large shortwave station at Akala, a dozen miles north of Colombo in Ceylon, as it was known in these days. A large shipment of radio equipment, including electronic items from the Marconi factory at Chelmsford and redundant antenna systems from the Isle of Wight, were shipped out from England. However, the entire consignment was lost to enemy submarine action in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Sri Lanka. Ultimately, a new consignment of equipment was sent out from England, and this was installed at the SEAC installation at Akala, where it was in use for many years for the relay of programming by the BBC London, the Voice of America, and Adventist World Radio. This SEAC station also carried programming on behalf of SLBC, the Sri Lanka Broadcasting Corporation. Back in 1965, Ronan O'Reilly in England ordered a 50-kilowatt medium-wave transmitter from Continental Electronics in Dallas, Texas, for installation on the ship Mi Amigo, which was on the air as the famous pirate radio station Radio Caroline. At the time, Continental was constructing several 50-kilowatt medium-wave transmitters, Model 317C, for various clients. However, the BBC suddenly needed two 50-kilowatt medium-wave transmitters for its new Central Africa relay station at Francistown in Botswana, and entrepreneur O'Reilly agreed to allow the BBC to take the number 12 transmitter that he had ordered. The BBC also took the additional unit, number 13, so O'Reilly agreed to accept transmitter number 14 in this series, which he installed on board the Mi Amigo. Some 15 years later, on March 19, 1980, the ship Mi Amigo encountered a Force 10 storm, and she drifted for 10 nautical miles before running aground on the Long Sand Bank. The ship sank next day, where she now lies in 10 feet of water in the Thames estuary out from London. The 50-kilowatt medium-wave transmitter also went down with the ship, and that is where it lies to this day, at the shallow bottom of the North Sea. You're listening to Wavescan from Adventist World Radio. Last week here on Wavescan, we presented interviews with Dario Monferini and Toshio Taki at the 2014 European DX Council Conference in France on the French Riviera. Well, this week we continue with an interview by Toshio Taki of David Rickwish of the Radio Heritage Foundation in New Zealand, also conducted at the EDXC conference in France.
Kia ora. This is David Rickwish from Wellington, New Zealand. I'm sitting here in Tende, near Nice in South France, and just been attending the EDXC conference. It's been a very interesting time to meet radio friends from many parts of Europe, many people whose names have been known to me for many years, to see their faces, to see some old friends again, and really to see how Europeans approach the hobby of DXing, how they organize it, the things that are of interest to them. And we've been listening to some interesting debates and discussions and presentations. We had one from Anker Petersen from Denmark, who talked of his cruise around the Caribbean, listening to some stations on FM and AM that I listened to years ago in New Zealand. So it's interesting to hear the stations mentioned again. Also, we've just seen a presentation on the shortwave transmitter at Örby in Sweden. I'm probably mispronouncing the name totally, but they're very historic because shortwave is closing down in many parts of the world, and it was interesting heritage to see how the people maintained the transmitters and the maintenance that was required, and the knowledge and the love of shortwave radio. And as well as those, there have been some other presentations. Interesting to meet my first Russians and learn about the DXing world in St. Petersburg. Also, of course, to hear the debates and discussions on the countries list. I think that's a very important thing for the DX world to have, is a countries list. And fine to see the arguments and discussions over what countries should be in and why others should be out, and all these reasons that really question our minds beyond the hobby and the fun of listening to the stations in the first place. Even today in 2015, shortwave still remains a fascinating form of radio and communication amongst peoples of the world. Although it's dying from state radio, we see that nearly every day new stations are closing down. It will last, I think, some years yet as new stations come on. It's almost a return to the old days when shortwave first started. It wasn't always state controlled. It was also controlled by entrepreneurs and companies and organizations, and there is a bit of a return to the past in shortwave radio, which will, I think, give some hope to shortwave DXs. But I think for the rest of us, we must accept that the golden days of shortwave radio have gone, and we should celebrate those and enjoy what has been in the past and what we've been privileged to hear and listen from stations around the world. And I think this EDXC conference is summed up by saying we've come 20,000 kilometers to be amongst friends, and we feel amongst friends.
Okay, thank you. And probably you may comment on some of the activities in New Zealand.
In New Zealand, we still have an international shortwave service, Radio New Zealand International. It has been operating for 70 years or so by now. It is still broadcasting to the Pacific, but on a different basis. It directs its broadcasts to rebroadcasting stations locally, AM and FM. So it's not meant for listeners in Europe or North America or Japan. It's meant for the listeners in Tonga and Samoa and Cook Islands. And that will continue, I think, for some years yet. They might not get new transmitters, much as I know they hope they would, but at least I think they will continue to get resourced and be allowed to continue broadcasting to their listeners in the Pacific. And that's a bit unlike Radio Australia, our nearby neighbours. They've made a different change and have a different approach, and very much driven by politics in Australia, and that is the same with shortwave radio in many parts of the world. But I think in New Zealand we've been listening to shortwave for since the 1920s. It's almost 100 years of DXing coming up, and I think there'll be plenty of shortwave stations still around for listeners in New Zealand to hear in 2020, 2021, 2022, 100 years of celebration of shortwave radio.
Thank you. How about the Radio Heritage Foundation?
Well, the Radio Heritage Foundation we established 10 years ago, much with the thought in mind that the heritage of radio broadcasting was being lost. As DXers die or lose interest in the hobby, their QSL card collections and the memorabilia and the radio stickers and the photographs and all the things that they've collected and were very important to them are often thrown away and don't get the respect that they deserve. We hope that our foundation will continue to attract interest from around the world, from people who see the benefit in keeping the heritage of radio broadcasting, and we hope very soon to allow everybody around the world to enter their own QSLs onto our website. Then the whole world can see them, and these collections will be available to everybody.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, now we are in Nice, the final point of the EDXC 2014. I'm with George Brown, and he will speak about his introduction and the impression on EDXC 2014.
Hi, I'm George Brown, as Toshi's just said. I'm from Edinburgh in Scotland. As already been said, we're now in Nice after a pleasant 2 days up in the mountains above Nice at a place called Tende. It was the most spectacular journey up and down, and we've had a pleasant trip to Monaco and finally to spend the last 2 days in Nice. It's nice to meet up with people that have been coming to these conferences for quite a few years, together with one or two new faces. And it's been extremely well organised. There's a lot of credit due to Christian, who had all the work since he's resident in this area. So hopefully the rest of the conference will go as well as the previous part of it. The presentation that was most interesting to me was the one on the South Pacific. Having just returned in January and February from a trip round the islands of the South Pacific. So it was, apart from that, it was an excellent presentation by David, and covered some of the places that I had visited.
You were listening there to an interview conducted by Toshio Taki of the Japan Shortwave Club at the European DX Council Conference on the French Riviera last September. Thanks to the Rhine-Main Radio Club of Germany for this recording. Well, it is rather obvious that a good reception report should contain detailed information that is heard from a radio broadcasting station, and it is preferable that this information should extend over a period of at least 20 minutes or more. However, there are occasions when a shorter reception report may be acceptable. Back on July 17, 1986, our DX editor Adrian Peterson was traveling by car for an appointment in a country area in Indiana, in the United States. In a lonely, isolated location where electrical interference would not be expected, Adrian stopped the car and turned on the radio receiver. The desired station was WQTC on 1520 kilohertz in the town of Bryan in the neighboring state Ohio. 4 years earlier, Adrian had visited this medium-wave radio station in Bryan when it was on the air under an earlier call sign, WBNO. At that time, this station was on the air with the usage of solar energy electricity, the first and only station in the United States that was using solar panels for this purpose. Adrian already had received a QSL from WBNO with 1/2 kilowatt on 1520 kilohertz. However, the station had been sold, and under the new management, the call sign was changed to WQTC, still with solar power and still with 1/2 kilowatt on the same channel, 1520 kilohertz. However, Adrian did desire a QSL card acknowledging the new call sign, WQTC. Unfortunately, even though medium wave station WQTC was on the air in the adjoining state, yet reception on the radio was terrible, with lots of QRN and QRM, local electrical noise and interference from other stations. However, at the bottom of the hour, Adrian did hear just two identifiable words, Bryan Radio. And so, Adrian sent a reception report and a prepared QSL card to the station in Bryan, Ohio. In the reception report, he apologized for such a brief report, but he stated that he had heard just two identifiable words, and that these two words indicated an advertisement for a radio shop in Bryan, or it was part of the station identification announcement. Well, in due course, the prepared QSL card, rubber-stamped onto a post office postal card, came back to his home address, duly signed and rubber-stamped with the old call sign WBNO, though the new call sign WQTC was also shown on the card. A verified reception report containing just two words. You'd better do better than that. Well, we're ending today's edition of Wavescan with some traditional dance music from Lifu in New Caledonia in the South Pacific. Thanks for listening to Wavescan, the international DX program from Adventist World Radio. Researched and written in Indianapolis by Dr. Adrian Peterson. Next week, radio broadcasting in the land of the Three Rivers, Diamond Jubilee celebrations. Our Australian DX report, and our special QSL of the week will be nostalgic memories of first radio broadcast. Several QSL cards are available for this program. Send your AWR and KSDA reception reports for Wavescan to the AWR address in Indianapolis and also to the station your radio is tuned into, WRMI or WWCR or KVOH, or to the AWR relay stations that carry Wavescan. Remember, too, you can send a reception report to each of the DX reporters when their segment is on the air here in Wavescan. Those segments from Japan, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Australia, and India. They will verify with their own colorful QSL card. Return postage and an address label are always appreciated. Our Wavescan address is Wavescan, Box 29235, Indianapolis, Indiana, 46229, USA. That's Wavescan, Box 29235, Indianapolis, Indiana, 46229, USA. Our email address is wavescan@awr.org. That's wavescan@awr.org. I'm Jeff White at shortwave station WRMI in Okeechobee, Florida. Till next week, good listening, everyone.
Whoa.